We're thrilled to have welcomed our first grandbaby recently. But growing this precious human hasn't been easy on our daughter. The unrelenting pregnancy fatigue really took it out of her.
One thing that helped was keeping her fluids up, and she loved Rehydrate. Rehydrate is an essential electrolyte drink made by some great guys right here in Brizzy. It's safe during pregnancy and breastfeeding and is like a magical little energy and hydration boost for mum and bub.
If you're growing a little human or are just feeling a little run down, grab some at Coles today.
It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
The secret really came down to fit. Every one of us, our individuality matters, and whether or not you can succeed or not is as much about finding that fit between who you are and the environment.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, and as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Mrs. Happy Families, my wife, Kylie. We're the parents of 6 girls. I've written 6 books about raising happy families, and today's podcast, an absolute must-listen if you've got kids at school who are struggling around standardisation in education, which is pretty much all of them.
Todd Rose is our guest on the podcast today. Todd is the co-founder and president of Populous, which is a think tank dedicated to transforming how we learn, work, and live. Basically, so we can all live a fulfilling life in a thriving society.
Until recently, Todd was also a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Dark Horse and The End of Average. Both of those books over the last few years have been at the top of my favorite books lists. In 2018, The End of Average just blew my mind. And in 2019, I said Dark Horse was my book of the year. He's got a fantastic story about his journey to becoming a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities.
Welcome to the Happy Families podcast, Todd, and thanks for joining us. I have to admit, I'm really excited about today's interview. I have picked up Dark Horse because you told me how good it was, and I've been reading it, and I'm really, really getting a lot out of what I'm reading. But this is actually the first time I've ever done an interview, and I'm a little bit nervous about how it's going to go.
So welcome, Todd. It's great to have you along.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
So Todd, I, a couple of years ago, came across your book, The End of Average. When I read it, and I heard about it from a fellow academic called Todd Cashton on his annual book review. He said this was one of the best books I read all year. And for me, it was one of the best books that I'd read all year. And then I came across your book, Dark Horse, which you've only released much more recently. And I just thought this is something that every person needs to know. Everyone needs to read this book. Everyone needs to understand it. The information in here is so valuable. And I want to talk about it with Kylie and you. But before we do that, can you just tell us a bit about your story? Because you've got this really compelling story that I think would give any parent who's worried about their child's future success just that little bit of reassurance and comfort that no matter how bad it is, it could still be okay.
Yeah, sure. Today I run a think tank and I have, another business, and I used to be a Harvard professor, but before that, I was also a high school dropout. And it's funny, it actually is kind of worse than that, right? Like I say dropout, they actually kicked me out, but I feel like it sounds better. It was like mutually agreed upon. But I ended up filling out with a 0.9 GPA. So I don't know how the grades work in Australia, but this is pretty bad. This is like a D- F average, right, across all things. And so
I think you and Justin have something in common.
Yeah, I mean, I finished high school, but the grade that they gave me was you scored in the bottom 15% of the state. Good luck with the rest of your life.
That's right. That's right. And so it was the beginning of my senior year, and I suddenly found myself, having to go to work. But really, just a couple months later, my girlfriend found out she was pregnant. Now I have to say, flash forward, still my wife today, 25 years later. And so that was actually the best mistake. But we had 2 kids within the span of, I was 21, and found I was working minimum wage jobs, and we actually ended up on welfare, and it just wasn't working. And so the short version is my dad told me, hey, look, there are plenty of great jobs that he felt like I could excel at, but I couldn't get there from where I was. And weirdly, I ended up, because of his example, I ended up going to college. I took my GED, which is like the equivalent of the high school diploma in the States, and enrolled in this open enrollment commuter school called Weber State University, which was just right up the road from where I lived, and slowly started to chip away at this out of just sheer couldn't go back to what it was. And I learned a lot about myself along the way, and I'm happy to give more examples of that. But weirdly, I ended up graduating as the honor student of the year with a 3.97 GPA in psychology and pre-med, and got into Harvard for my doctorate.
Todd, we're twins. I mean, this is so much like my story. I barely scraped through high school. I'm working some minimum wage jobs, and then I get this radio career. But then I go back to school in my late 20s.
With the belief at that point that you were actually a high school dropout.
And had no capacity, didn't belong there, but ended up doing a psychology degree and graduated with first class honours and went on to do a doctorate in psychology. I'm hearing that maybe this is why I like your book so much. So you end up at Harvard. And then, I mean, the career just keeps on going. You end up as a professor at Harvard University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, high school dropout, couple of kids, and all of a sudden, how does that happen?
It's funny. A lot of people, I was just trying to get through, right? I was trying to survive. And it was only, I remember the first press interview I ever did when I got into Harvard, and it was like the local newspaper, and they were like, wait, what? How? And what I realized is, they said, oh, you must have just buckled down and started working harder. And when I thought about it, I realized that really wasn't true. I really did work hard. I mean, there were some gaps in that where I'd kind of given up. But what I realized is the secret really came down to fit. Every one of us, our individuality matters. And whether or not you can succeed or not is as much about finding that fit between who you are and the environment. And so even in the context of a reasonably standardized college experience, there was enough wiggle room where I was able to make some pretty meaningful choices. Some of them were really counterintuitive, to the point where the university was like, I don't think you're supposed to do this. And literally made me sign a paper saying I knew what I was doing, but it was about fit over standardized sequences. And the more I learned about that and realized as long as I was in my element and I had created that good fit, I was as good as anybody. And when I got outside of that fit, it was a slog. And so that carried with me all the way into my academic research and even the work I do now.
This is the Happy Families podcast. We'll continue our discussion with Todd in just a moment.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
This is the Happy Families podcast, and today we're talking to Todd Rose, a Harvard professor, author, and founder of the think tank Populous. In your book, The End of Average, you unpack the idea of standardization in schools, and one of the points you make is that standardization actually has its place. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, societies don't function if it's a free-for-all, and there's a lot of stuff that as human beings we have in common, and sometimes even when it's not the best, you end up finding the best possible way on average to do something in the name of efficiency. And so even though I believe we're quite a bit down the road from needing a lot of that, I do appreciate that when standardization really became a thing, about 100 years ago, we were living across the world in a very different time. And, so the role for it, as I see it, is twofold. So one, anything outside of human beings, I mean, God bless you, go crazy, right? I want my Tylenol to be standardized with every pill, right? There's things that I really do want to be true about standardized processes.
Yeah, so when you're making a car, you need it to be standardized, right? You need to know that the nuts and bolts, they're standardized, and we need to have a standardized system so that things function effectively. That's critically important.
But when it comes to human beings, and particularly how you think about who they are, what they're capable of, that's where it breaks down. That's where whatever upside there is to it is swamped by the profound downside in terms of what standardization does to human beings with respect to both it's soul crushing, right? In terms of not really being able to realize your full potential. But the truth is that as communities and as a global society, like, we lose out on their uniqueness and the things that they have to contribute. So the truth is, where we have to get is a nice balance.
When it comes to raising our children and putting them into a standardized educational system, the same system that frankly you and I struggled in, and so many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kids today are struggling in. We've got a standardized system with standardized high stakes testing, and we've got a standardized process to get into university and a standardized career path. I love what you said in Dark Horse. You basically said from the time our children are born until the time they retire, their life is standardized.
Yeah. And the thing is that it like I said, it's bad for individuals, it's bad for society. And you think about education, like, we literally have kids all over the world, like, depending on where you're at, like, if you're in the same country, you are learning basically the same things about the same time, in the same pace, same sequence, right? And even like in the States, education is the last place that still incentivizes designing on average. So we call it like developmentally appropriate. So you take like a textbook and it's like, say, 6th grade science or something. It's like the reading level is, what does the average 6th grader know, right? What can they read? Well, there isn't an average 6th grader, right? And so, especially with our technologies now, you don't have to do it, right? It is drop dead simple to have incredibly flexible, what we would call universally designed environments that are far more inclusive, right? You don't have to have the same fixed sequence. Kids can move at their own pace, and it doesn't have to be chaos. We can see over and over again that you can actually get more efficient, more effective learning environments with a little bit more flexibility and personalization.
So as a mum of 6 children who literally can see that there is no cookie cutter average in my own home, just with my 6 children, this idea of personalization, kind of living, intrigues me heaps. I've loved listening to what we're talking about today. I'm wondering, Todd, whether or not we might be able to get you back in a few weeks' time to really kind of, I guess, unpack this idea for parents and help them to, kind of be able to internalize these messages so that they can help their children navigate this world that we live in of standardization. How do we personalize it for them?
That sounds great. Count me in.
Awesome.
So the book is called Dark Horse, Achieving Success Through Fulfillment. And it takes parents through this idea that we've got a standardized system that may not be working for every child. And it's changed the way I view so much, Todd. Awesome to talk to you. Can't wait to do it again.
Thank you.
Well, it's just been so good chatting with Todd Rose on today's Happy Families podcast. I'm really looking forward to having Todd back on the podcast in the next few weeks. I'm Dr. Justin Coulson. If you would like more info about how we can make your family happier, you can get all the info that you need at happyfamilies.com.au, where we have our Happy Families memberships. Families getting bigger and happier every day. Or you can find more info at my Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families. If you do enjoy the podcast as well, we'd love for you to leave a rating and review. You can do that at Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening, because it helps people to find the podcasts and have happier families. Thanks to Justin Rulon from Bridge Media for making us sound great. Our producer and our executive producer is Craig Bruce. Once again, all the info you need to make your family happier at happyfamilies.com.au.